Hello, welcome to part 13 of toxin sequestration theory. This is my new theory of cancer, and of course, it's very different from the mainstream. We're arguing here that cancer tumors are the body's defense mechanism against toxic overload, and that cancer itself is actually not a disease. Rather, it's a symptom of toxic overload, and the true underlying disease is toxic overload. This is, of course, part of my broader theory that toxicity is at the heart of chronic disease. Every single chronic disease, whether it's Alzheimer's, autism, Parkinson's, diabetes, or heart disease, they're all connected to toxicity. And cancer's job is actually to protect the body against those diseases, prevent the body from getting those diseases. And that's why it can be very dangerous to really focus on treating the cancer tumor itself, because you could end up getting rid of the tumor and giving yourself another disease like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, heart disease, etc. So anyway, needless to say, this is very different from the mainstream view. And we've talked in this multi-part YouTube series about many different toxins that cancer cells sequester, store, and process. We've talked about the sugars, glucose and fructose. We talked about plant toxins like oxalates. We talked about seed oils. We talked about a little bit about deuterium. We talked about some of the metals like iron, hormones like estrogen, and we've also talked about some industrial things like microplastics and benzene. And we even talked about mycotoxins, which are fungal toxins. All of those, by the way, are toxins that cancer cells intentionally pull in and either store them or process them. And I just want to address my critics out there. Sometimes I'll occasionally get some trolls on social media that say, "Oh, like this is an interesting hypothesis, but let's see some evidence," right? Well, guess what? Every time I talk about a toxin, I am presenting evidence for that toxin, because I am showing, I'm citing the literature, and I'm giving evidence that the toxin is preferentially sequestered and stored by cancer cells. No other theory can explain that. The genetic theory of cancer, that's the mainstream, it cannot explain why cancer cells are sequestering and storing toxins. And similarly, Thomas Seyfried's metabolic theory of cancer cannot explain that either. So there's no other theory of cancer out there that can explain why are cancer cells, number one, full of toxins, and I presented evidence for that. And number two, why do they actively pull them in? So it's not just like, oh, they're accidentally getting these toxins. They are actively pulling in the toxins. And also, in the cases where the toxins can be processed, like cigarette smoke, ethanol, fructose, or estrogen, it upregulates its detox enzymes. So the cancer cells will actually intentionally upregulate their detox enzymes to detoxify those toxins. So I just want to be clear that I have presented tons of evidence for this theory. I cite the medical literature. Every time I talk about a toxin, I am citing the medical literature on how that toxin has been shown to occur in higher quantities inside of cancer cells, or is actively sequestered inside of cancer cells or processed by cancer cells. And so in this video, I want to give even more evidence for this. I'm going to talk about some more toxins, and I'm going to start off by talking about forever chemicals. Now, I want to give credit to one of my YouTube followers who actually recommended this topic. By the way, if you have an idea for something I should look into, please leave a comment, because I pay attention to every single comment on my video. And one of my YouTube followers suggested that I look into forever chemicals, PFAS, to see if they actually are sequestered and stored by cancer cells. It was a great idea. I looked into it, and sure enough, it's true. So like I said, and there's been wonderful comments on my YouTube videos, so please keep leaving comments, because I pay attention to every single one. So yeah, let's start off with the forever chemicals. And like I said, these are classic toxins. I mean, no one thinks that forever chemicals are good for you, right? No, these are, by the way, found in things like non-stick pans, and Teflon, and they're found also in a lot of like fire extinguisher equipment. They're found in water and stain-resistant clothing and carpets, food packaging and fast food wrappers. One of the really common places where they're found are in this like microwave popcorn bags. So in the bags of microwave popcorn, they're in there. So obviously those are bad. And they're also found in cosmetics and personal care products. Unfortunately, people get exposed to these forever chemicals on the job. So like if you're a plumber, right, and you're always dealing with Teflon, these Teflon tapes, then you're going to get exposed there. And similarly, if you're a firefighter, then you're getting exposed to these forever chemicals as well, because it's in that stuff. So yeah, anyway, so these forever chemicals, they're called PFAS. They're like, that's an acronym. It stands for like polyfluoroalkyl substances. And basically what they are is if you take a nice, well-behaved organic molecule and then you take off all the hydrogens and you substitute fluorine atoms in for them, then you get a forever chemical. And those carbon-fluorine bonds are the real problem, because carbon and fluorine bond really tightly, and it's really hard. The body can't really break down those chemical bonds, and the body doesn't know what to do with them. It doesn't have any means to like break those carbon-fluorine bonds, and that's why they're called forever chemicals, because they just last forever in the body, and the body can only store them. It doesn't really have a way to kind of detoxify them. And if you look at where these chemicals store in the body, they tend to store in many organs, including the liver, the kidneys, the lungs, and in men, the testicles. So yeah, and I think the liver is the primary storage deposit for these forever chemicals. But like I said, it's also found in kidneys, lungs, and testes. And as I will get to, as you can imagine, I've talked about this toxin to organ mapping. Now, what is the toxin to organ mapping? It's basically a way to understand why tumors arise in certain organs based on certain toxic exposures. We've already talked about how if you're exposed to benzene, then you're likely going to get something like leukemia, which is bone marrow / blood cancer. So there's a direct mapping from benzene to leukemia. And then similarly, if you're chronically consuming glucose and fructose, then you're potentially risking pancreatic cancer. And in the prostate, it's things like seed oils. For the breast cancer, it's excess estrogen and oxalates. So different sets of toxins give rise to different types of cancer. Now, interestingly, for the case of PFAS, for these forever chemicals, because the body can't really process them very well, then as you can imagine, it might just try to form cancer tumors to store them wherever they're most concentrated, right? And so since they do naturally concentrate in the liver, the kidneys, the lungs, and the testes, then those are also the same places where they give rise to cancer tumors. And so the toxin to organ mapping for these forever chemicals is they give rise to liver cancer, kidney cancer, lung cancer, and testicular cancer. So it's actually kind of simple. In this case, basically the tumors form precisely where the forever chemicals tend to accumulate. And of course, this highlights the role that the tumor's job is to store and sequester these toxins and prevent them from causing harm in the rest of the body, right? So naturally, the body would want to build a tumor right there where the toxic burden is highest in order to sequester these forever chemicals and pull them away from the healthy tissue. In case it isn't obvious, these forever chemicals are a toxin. They do, just like every other toxin that I've discussed, they create these reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and they do that by impairing mitochondrial function, and they also trigger lipid peroxidation in cell membranes, which is yet another way of producing reactive oxygen species, and they also deplete our antioxidant defenses, enhancing the impact of these ROS chemicals. So through multiple pathways, these forever chemicals create oxidative stress. They create these ROS chemicals. And as I said in my theory, anything that creates ROS is something that cancer cells should want or try to sequester, because that's their job. That's the cancer cell's job, is to reduce the amount of oxidative stress in the body by pulling in toxins that would create oxidative stress if they were allowed to roam free. So now, like I said, the body has some standard defenses against PFAS. Not very good ones, by the way, because these forever chemicals are, oftentimes resistant to really breakdown. But under normal conditions, assuming you have healthy liver, healthy kidneys, the liver will try to do some minor packaging of these forever chemicals, and the kidney will try to filter them out and excrete them in the urine. And naturally, the body will try to use glutathione and antioxidants to neutralize the ROS that these forever chemicals create. That's basically, as you can imagine, that's probably why organs like the liver and the kidneys accumulate these forever chemicals, because those are your primary detox organs. And so, the liver and the kidneys, they're going to try their best to do something useful with these forever chemicals and try to get them out in the urine if they can. But yeah, nevertheless, that can explain why the liver and kidneys are often, basically seen to accumulate these forever chemicals. And, in case some people ask me, by the way, like, oh, should you eat the organ meats of animals? And I generally do not encourage people to eat things like liver and kidneys, because those are detox organs, and their job is to, filter and process and store toxins. So it is worth noting that I personally do not eat liver and kidneys from other animals, even though I am a carnivore. I focus on muscle meat. So just worth noting that there are toxins inside of those detox organs. All right, so anyway, let's talk about how, if your detox organs are falling behind and they're not able to cope with these forever chemicals, then cancer will step in to be a, protective sink for these forever chemicals. And what they do is that there's evidence that they upregulate the transporters on their cell surfaces to actively pull in these forever chemicals. The forever chemicals will stick to blood serum proteins, things like albumin. So the forever chemicals will actually get stuck to the albumin that floats in the blood. And then there's certain transporters that will pull in those sort of PFAS-bound proteins. And they have names. I'll just give you the names. Basically, there's a transporter that's called the organic anion transporter polypeptides, or OATPs. That's just a name of a transporter that will pull in the protein that's bound to the forever chemical. And the cancer cells have been shown to upregulate those transporters. So this is real evidence. So people who want evidence, like, this is medical literature saying that the cancer cells upregulate the transporters to pull in the forever chemicals. And similarly, once the forever chemicals are inside the cancer cells, they will the cancer cells will actually store the forever chemicals into lipid droplets. And we've talked about this before for seed oils. So you remember from my seed oil discussion that whenever seed oils are pulled inside of cancer cells, the seed oils aren't used for any purpose. They're literally just packaged into like spherical droplets. And then they're just floating around inside of cancer cells, these lipid droplets, and just for safekeeping, to keep them, sequestered and stored away. That's exactly what happens with forever chemicals too. They will package up the forever chemicals into lipid droplets, sometimes even in the same lipid droplets as the seed oils. So they'll put the forever chemicals in the same lipid droplets sometimes with the seed oils. And so the exact same mechanism that cancer cells use to store seed oils is how they store forever chemicals, in lipid droplets. And it has been shown that these lipid droplets are dramatically higher inside of cancer cells than inside of normal tissue. I've already talked about this, by the way, for brain cancer. So in brain cancer, normal brain tissue has no lipid droplets in it, but cancerous brain tissue is full of lipid droplets. So it's like a night and day thing. And yeah, so that's the basic idea. Basically, they upregulate the transporters to pull the forever chemicals in. They store them in lipid droplets, just like they do with seed oils. And I've given you the toxin organ mapping. I've told you how basically these forever chemicals map on to liver cancer, kidney cancer, lung cancer, and testicular cancer. So that's basically the story for forever chemicals. And it fits in perfectly. And like I said, if you were to try to explain the fact that cancer cells love forever chemicals with some other theory, it doesn't make any sense, right? In the other theories, they say that cancer is selfish. If cancer was so selfish, why would it want to pull in toxic chemicals that everyone agrees these forever chemicals are toxic? So why would cancer cells want to do that? It doesn't really make sense from the selfish perspective. Let's move on to another toxin, which is AGEs, advanced glycation end products. Now, this is near and dear to people who think a lot about diet. So if you're really interested in keto diets and carnivore diets and that kind of stuff, you've probably heard of the term advanced glycation end products because they're closely related to sugar intake, glucose and fructose. We've already talked about how glucose and fructose themselves are toxins, but now let's talk about something that they actually create. So inside of the body, like if you have chronically elevated blood sugar, like if you're always having high blood sugar, say if you're a diabetic, then you basically have an AGE factory inside your body. All that elevated blood sugar will cause glycation. Glycation is where a sugar molecule gets stuck on to like a protein or a lipid, and all these glycation events will be happening inside your body. This is the kind of thing that I think the hemoglobin A1C, HbA1c actually measures, right? To check to see if you have elevated blood sugar. And yeah, so, but it's not just eating sugar by itself is not the only way that you get these AGEs. Also, there's the fact that you can literally eat AGEs themselves. So some people will just be eating AGEs naturally in their diet. For example, if you take a piece of meat and then you smother it in some sugary sauce like a honey glaze or teriyaki or barbecue sauce, and then you cook it, then all those sugar molecules will end up sticking to the proteins and the fats that are in the meat, and you're actually making AGEs in the cooking process. And when you eat that, some fraction of those AGEs will actually get into your body. So roughly 10 to 30% of the AGEs that you eat actually get into your body. And so actually get into your bloodstream. So that's it's a meaningful fraction. And so it's not just like, oh, well, I can eat as much AGEs as I want. No, it's actually not true. And even if, I'm a carnivore, by the way, and technically speaking, you can still get exposed to some AGEs. Obviously, you're not going to get nearly as much as you would on the standard American diet or standard Western diet. But nevertheless, like if you use sort of cooking methods that are dry and high heat. So the dry, high heat cooking methods are grilling, frying, and broiling. And those tend to form AGEs whenever you cook like that. As a general rule, you want to be cooking, to avoid formation of AGEs, you want to be cooking moist with water or cooking at lower heat. So things like steaming, boiling, poaching, slow cooking, light searing, or as well just simply eating your steaks rare or raw, those will minimize the amount of AGEs in your food. So what's exciting is that, I've talked about how specific toxins occur in specific foods, but I haven't really talked about how specific cooking methods actually lead to more toxins. And so this is the first time I've really talked about how the way that you cook your food could lead to more or less toxins in your food. And like I said, as a general rule, you can try to cook with more moisture or cook at lower heat to avoid formation of these AGEs. And I even experimented this. I posted this blog post yesterday, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to actually experiment myself. And I actually just tried, let me try to make some, and I know this sounds weird, but let me try to cook like fish or cook some beef with a little bit of water in the pan, just to get that moisture in there. And I tried it, and it worked just fine. And of course, many cultures use things like steaming as a cooking method. So I'm going to try to incorporate more moisture into my cooking in the future. Okay, so AGEs, like I said, they are what happens when you stick a glucose or fructose molecule onto a biomolecule like a protein or a lipid. And there's, like I said, there's two key ways that they are formed. They are either formed endogenously from having chronically elevated blood sugar. So if you naturally have elevated blood sugar, you'll just be forming AGEs throughout your whole body tissues. The other way that they're formed is in the food themselves that you eat. So you could be eating the AGEs, and they get into your digestive tract, and then some fraction of them, like a quarter of the AGEs that you eat, get into your bloodstream. So those are the two ways that you get exposed to AGEs, and they are toxins. So it's actually fascinating because I did find that when I cut out sugar and carbs out of my diet, that led to major health benefits. And it's interesting because it's not just cutting out the glucose and fructose themselves, it's also cutting out the AGEs, right? And the AGEs do create reactive oxygen species. They are technically toxins and create oxidative stress. They can also stiffen your tissues and arteries. So, a healthy artery would be flexible, have, normal blood flow. But interestingly, these AGEs can cause something called cross-linking that reduces the elasticity of your arteries and stiffen them. So that's actually one biological effect of having too much AGEs. You get stiff arteries. As toxins, they create ROS. The job of cancer tumors will be to pull them in, sequester them, and store them. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. This fits the pattern perfectly. So, cancer cells are, they basically have transporters on their cell surface to pull these things in. And then there is tons of evidence, once again, that AGEs are found in higher concentrations inside of cancer cells than inside of normal tissue. And this has been shown for various cancers, including colorectal cancer, breast cancer, kidney cancer, as well as other cancers. There's actual literature that shows that cancer cells have higher AGEs inside them than normal tissue does. And this is fully expected within my theory because any chemical that creates oxidative stress should be something that cancer cells try to sequester. Now, what's the toxin to organ mapping for AGEs? So once again, we find that basically the tumors seem to form where the burden is most heavy. And the places where the AGE burden is most heavy are the liver, the kidneys, and the colon. As you can imagine, the colon receives heavy exposure to dietary AGEs, just from literally the foods that you eat, from the cooked and processed foods. And, I should mention, by the way, that ultra-processed foods have tons of AGEs, right, as you can imagine. So, sometimes we tend to focus a little bit too much on, the AGEs that might be in meat and not on some of the AGEs that are in like the standard diet. So certainly these ultra processed foods, especially foods that have seed oils in them, they have tons of AGEs. The colon is going to be exposed to all those dietary AGEs, and so naturally the body would want to build a tumor locally to try to sequester and store the AGEs in the colon. Similarly, the liver is the primary site for fructose metabolism and endogenous AGE formation. So, whenever your sugar intake is high, the liver is going to be having a lot of AGE exposure. So that's why it would be linked to liver cancer. And then with kidneys, once again, its job is to filter the blood, so it's going to be exposed to a lot of AGEs just from the AGEs in the blood, due to hyperglycemia. All right, so basically AGEs map onto liver cancer, kidney cancer, and colon cancer. And of course, this gives us some hope, because if you do, have cancers like these, some of the ones that I've discussed, you can consider lowering your exposure to these toxins. I believe that toxin sequestration theory gives people agency and hope, because it says that the cause of the tumor is toxic overload, right? So all you have to do is reduce your exposure to these toxins, and you will reduce the body's need for a toxin storage vault. And we've talked about how when you reduce your toxic load, the body may decide to stop having a tumor. So, all right, so that's basically the idea. I've talked about these two toxins. It adds to our growing list of toxins in toxin sequestration theory. Thanks very much for listening.